Okay, now I'm going back to the basic issues that we were having in the background while we were talking about the film. So let's just, and they are restated in its sort of more Hegelian language, which is unfortunately not the language that you guys speak, or me either. But I'll translate them into common sense talk on 97 at the beginning of problem 2. So we're going to hear again about the ethical and the suspension of the ethical and the way to go against the ethical. And it says at the beginning of the first full paragraph, in the ethical view of life, then, it is, and now I've got to go through this complicated, crazy thing of putting all these individuals and particulars back into the way they should be. Not in the way they should be in Kierkegaard, because I said there's only one word in Danish for the individual and the particular. I don't know how he and his readers understood it, but I can make it easier for you if you just do what I say and cross out the word, put in the words particular and individual where they belong. So I'm going to do that as I read. In the ethical view of life, then, it is the particulars task. You understand why? I don't do this just dumbly and blindly. Particulars are just any old people, or even, as I say, dogs or briefcases. They're all particulars. But then there's this special thing that Kierkegaard wants to single out, namely an individual. And an individual is somebody who has an identity by way of having an unconditional commitment. So it obviously isn't individual in that sense. It's the particular's task to divest himself of the determinant of interiority and give it expression in the exterior. Well, that's code. We know interiority under a different name already. It's the lower immediacy. So he's supposed to get rid of lower immediacy and give it an expression in the exterior. That means mediation. The interiority is all your moods and feelings and private stuff, and the exterior is the public language which you share with everybody else. Now, whenever the particular shrinks from doing so, that is, getting mediated, whenever he wants to stay inside or slip back into the inner determinant of feeling, mood, etc., he commits an offense and he is in a state of temptation, that he's given in to going down from the ethical to lower immediacy. The paradox of faith is this, that there is an interiority, that's an immediacy, that is incommensurable with the exterior, that, in other words, can't be made intelligible. An interiority which, it should be stressed, is not identical with the first. The first interiority is lower immediacy, which is that of the child. Remember I said, so you think of the immediate as where you start. But it's a new interiority. Now I'll ask you, what's the name we had for that in the preliminary, what do you call it, the preamble from the heart? What is it that you've got that isn't immediacy and it isn't mediation either, but something you get after both of those? Remember the name? Yes, good. Who said it? Good. Higher immediacy. That's what he's talking about. Everything's just got a new name. It is not identical with the first, but is a new interiority. That's the higher immediacy. This must not be overlooked. Recent philosophy, that's Hegel, has allowed itself without further ado to substitute the immediate for faith. That is, faith is just lumped together with all the other private feelings that you have and that kids have. In Hegel, he's only got two categories for this. There's either immediacy or there's mediation. There's a third something or other, but you don't have to think about it, and it's not higher immediacy. There's no such thing in Hegel as higher immediacy. So, faith is higher immediacy. You can see it better if you go back to 84, where he introduces these issues, and I'll read you just two places there. It's the same point, but in this, and pretty clear here, with a few mixed up particulars and all that. On 84, for faith is just this paradox, that the individual, single doesn't help any, right? Just cross it out. Really, you should write the individual probably with a capital I, because for Kierkegaard, that's a big deal. For faith is just this paradox, that the individual is higher than the universal, though in such a way be it noted that the movement is repeated, that is, that having been in the universal, the particular now sets himself apart as the individual, above the universal. See, the particular couldn't be above the universal. I mean, nonsense. If that is not faith, then Abraham is done for, and faith has never existed in the world just because it's always existed. I think we went through that little puzzle once before, a few lectures back, but it's such a funny thing that we have to do it again. Why would it be true, if we followed Hegel, that faith never existed because it always existed? You should be able to say that. Somebody should. I'm sure we did discuss it once, didn't we? Or am I imagining things? We did. Okay, then, so faith has never existed because it's always existed. Well, let me read you another quote before I tell you, and maybe you'll see that. The bottom of 84. Faith is just this paradox, that the individual, as the individual, is higher than the universal, is justified before the latter, not as subordinate, but as superior, though in such a way be it noted that it is the particular who, having been subordinate to the universal, as the particular, now, by means of the universal, by going through it, that is, becomes the individual who, as the individual, stands in absolute relation to the absolute, that is, has an unconditional commitment. Now let's go on. We're going to get back to this funny phrase. This position cannot be mediated, for all mediation occurs by virtue of the universal, and it remains in all eternity a paradox, inaccessible to thought. And yet faith is this paradox. And now comes the puzzle again. Or else, these are implications which I would ask the reader always to bear in mind, though it would be too complicated for me to spell them out each time. Or else faith has never existed just because it's always existed, and Abraham is done for. What would it mean? What does Hegel think faith is? We just saw earlier. The interior and lower immediacy. Has that always existed? The childish, the moods, the private stuff? It's always existed. Well, if faith is lower immediacy, then faith has always existed. But has anything like what Kierkegaard means by faith ever existed? No. Because faith gets just lumped with all this lower immediacy stuff. And if faith is higher immediacy, this special unconditional commitment, and if you've got no place in your philosophy but either lower immediacy or mediation, then faith gets lumped with lower immediacy, and what Kierkegaard means by faith, where you're an individual, never existed, because it just got lumped with everything else that always existed. You got it now? Is it okay? I mean, if you don't get it, then you've got to keep sort of thinking about it until you do, because it's something that's pretty simple. He's just putting it in this sort of tricky, complicated way. And what's important isn't the fancy way, but that according to Kierkegaard, there is something, and I'll keep coming back to this, something absolutely crucial that people can do, but they can't understand. We've seen it once so far. What is the Knight of Faith in the preamble from the heart able to do that people, including himself or herself, can't understand? Well, it's to see the sword hanging over the head of the beloved, and instead of having defenses by trying to keep from getting involved or by making the movements of resignation if you are involved, you try to defend yourself that way, sensibly, against the vulnerability. The thing that you do that you can't understand, if you're a Knight of Faith, is get more and more involved, seeing the sword hanging over the head of the beloved, and yet getting more and more involved as if it was the surest and safest thing of all. From pure rational intelligibleness, that makes no sense at all. That's an absolutely stupid thing to do, to make the whole meaning of your life and happiness depend on this vulnerable relationship. And that's the first one. But now remember, and this is all just getting it all back in your memory, that we've switched from the issue about the vulnerability of the person you love, where Isaac was an example of that. And now Isaac is the ethical. And because Abraham is both going to lose Isaac, that is, he's got to resign himself to the fact that Isaac might be dead. The fact that Abraham has to do it just complicates things in a way we don't have to think about and don't need to think about. That's just Kierkegaard getting wound up in breaking his engagement with Regina, and that just makes things confusing. The main thing is Abraham sees that Isaac is vulnerable, and Abraham goes on without unruffled, getting involved with Isaac and letting the whole meaning of his life depend on Isaac. Now, suppose Isaac is the ethical instead of the object of a defining commitment. Well, then, now we have to think of Abraham as killing Isaac. And if Abraham is killing Isaac, then Abraham's a murderer. It doesn't really matter anymore whether it's Isaac, that is his defining commitment, he's killing. If Abraham were killing anybody, he'd be a murderer. And the idea that Abraham is somehow doing this completely unethical thing and somehow feeling at the same time that that's what he really has to do, that it's the best thing he could do, that he could feel that and thereby do this mysterious thing of going against the ethical while feeling justified, but utterly unable to explain how what he's doing could possibly be justified. I gave you an example, remember, of the person who was homosexual in Denmark, in Copenhagen in 1850, feeling that their love of whoever is the best thing in their life and gives their world meaning and gives them an identity, and feeling that it is an absolutely unethical, despicable, depraved, disgusting, unnatural, whatever thing to do. I'll give you another example, because this for the whole ethical story. You've got to keep this is the puzzle. So the puzzle is to do something that you can't understand, but yet feel called upon to do. It seems to be the right thing to do, but when you try to explain it, it turns out to be the wrong thing to do. That got it with killing somebody. Abraham's killing Isaac. You get it with the homosexual story. Take another example. Suppose some kid, I don't think I said this, about a kid raised in Germany from the time they were born. So the Third Reich, the Nazis lasted something like, I think, 13 years. Right? Roughly, anyway. Long enough that some kid could be born under the Nazis and raised and educated under the Nazis, so as to believe that Jews were just the biggest threat to civilization and inferior and dangerous, and it was every good person's duty to turn them in and get them exterminated. And now suppose this kid, we'll suppose he's 13, gets to like or falls in love with, now we leave out homosexual, falls in love with a girl, if it's, let's say he's a boy kid, and this is the most wonderful, important thing in his life. But turns out she's Jewish. Now, it's his duty to turn her in. It's intelligible. It's the heroic, the Aryan, the human, the rational, the ethical thing to do. He's never heard of anything else. But he feels that this is the best thing that ever happened to him. So he doesn't turn her in, he hides her. Well, when he hides her, he does something which he feels is absolutely justified and absolutely wrong at the same time. And there's no way he can explain it to himself. It's inconceivable that you could have sex with somebody of the same sex. It's inconceivable that you could protect one of these awful subhuman creatures, and yet this person does it. And now I want to say again, does it even though they can't understand what they're doing. But they do it because they feel that it is exactly the best thing they could do. And you could make up other such stories, I'm sure, And it's always important not to say to yourself, Kierkegaard talks about this, well, in the end it'll turn out to be all right. Abraham, after all, didn't kill Isaac. So it must have been all, whatever Abraham did, it was terrific. And the Nazis got rid of the Nazis and re-educated the kids, and they understood that everything they hid, the guy who hid the girl understood now with great relief that it was the right thing to do. And we're in Berkeley in 2006, and we don't think that it's depraved to be gay anymore. But as Kierkegaard keeps saying, that is irrelevant. It's not important how it turned out with Abraham, whether he killed Isaac or not. He was a murderer in the sense that you're a murderer if you go around trying to stab somebody with an intent to kill them. Whether some angel comes and stops you at the last minute or not doesn't make you any less of a murderer from within it, from when you're doing it. And you have to think about how this is this existential thing, not from the point of view of some us looking on from Berkeley or for some rational perspective, but how it was to the person doing it. And no matter how it turned out, whether the Nazis lost out and the gay won out and the ram got killed instead of Isaac, that's irrelevant. What we want to understand is the state of mind of the person doing it. And they're doing something they can't understand. That's paradoxical. They're doing something that they absolutely shouldn't do, and they can't understand how they could possibly be doing it, and yet it seems the thing they ought to do, have to do, should do, and so forth. Yeah. Of Romeo and Juliet, not quite, but I think it's important to see why not. And why not? Well, but I think it's a good issue. You understand? She's asking, could you do a story like this about Romeo and Juliet? Here they are loving each other, protecting each other, hiding from their families who hate each other. And it's sort of inconceivable that the Capulets and who are the other guys? Montagues could ever get together and sort of bless this wedding. But I don't think it's inconceivable enough. It seems like, well, if only we could talk to them and convince them, and of course, after a lot of suffering at the end, they do get together. But that's looking back from the end again. Well, it's all what you hear in inconceivable. I don't think it's as inconceivable that the Capulets and Montagues get together as that to a Nazi kid, you save a Jew, or to a gay person, you get applauded, or at least you're accepted as a perfectly fine member of the community. So, but I don't know how to. It's a nice question because it really says to me, define inconceivable, and I can't. I've got an intuition about it. I've got examples of it, and you're on a borderline. You have to tell more and more of the story, but I'm afraid the more you told, the more you discover that it doesn't work very well, because these people are all part of a community, the Capulets and the Montagues, which have so much in common. That's maybe what's important. Unlike the Jews and the Nazis, or the gays hidden in the closets in Copenhagen, and the straight married people, who really have no common language to discuss those issues.
They're not to transcend language, but it's like
it's incommunicable. It transcends. Am I saying it transcends language as an incommunicable? Yes. Let's go into that. Yes, it transcends the intelligibility, which is the ethical, which is a language in which you have words for what's right and wrong, words for what's worthy and not worthy. There isn't any language for homosexual that isn't a language already totally disparaging and saying it's unworthy in 1850 Denmark. And that's, so in Kierkegaard's way of talking, and I think it's right, if there is something all outside the ethical, really outside it, you won't have any language in which to describe it except as bad. Or maybe just you will have no language and it'll just be neutral. You just have no name for it. But what you can't do is find a language in which you can describe in a neutral way what all the words in the ethical tell you is unworthy. That's his idea. I think it's a good idea. I think it's probably right. So, anything else? Okay, well, this is all background in a way, getting ready to go further, but it's hard and interesting stuff. Let me see now where I am. So another way to put it is, for Hegel, any way of going against the universal is sinning, and faith requires you to go against the universal because there's a higher authority in your life. So faith is sinning, and then you get, that is, or another way to put it, faith is making an exception of yourself, and that's always unethical. Ethical is always universal. You're supposed to do what any rational, good person does. All of that's the same point. And if the only way, I've got another way to put this funny paradox-like thing, if the only way to make an exception of yourself were to leave the universal and act as a particular, telling lies, stealing things, whatever, then faith would never have existed because it would always have existed. Because faith is just another way of leaving the universe, would be just another way of leaving the universal and making an exception of yourself. And if you've got no distinction between high exceptions and low exceptions, they all look the same. I'm just saying the same thing again. For Hegel, making an exception of yourself is going down to lower immediacy. If you've only got philosophical categories, there's no other way you can see it. And I'll read you I've read that. That's my version of the top of 85, which I was reading. But now I'm going to change the subject. That's pretty much review. But now we want to know, how do you tell when somebody is making an exception of themselves and going against the ethical, whether what they're doing is lower immediacy or higher immediacy? That's a puzzle. You don't want to just get every crazy person who goes against the ethical and makes an exception of themselves put together. You want to be able to tell an unconditional commitment from a temptation. And so on 90, Kierkegaard is saying, or de Silentio is saying, you better have some kind of criterions by which you can tell at the bottom of 90. So when the single individual is in absolute relation to the absolute, toward the bottom, is he justified? His justification is, once again, the paradox. For if he is the paradox, it's not by virtue of being anything universal, but by being the individual. We're back to that. How does the individual assure himself that he's justified? That's a big problem. And Kierkegaard has lots of interesting things to say about it. But let's we need some examples first. How are we going to rule out as lower immediacy examples like M? I think I did mention M, didn't I? Maybe briefly. Briefly. M is this wonderful movie. Anybody seen M since I recommended it? Or you've seen it already anyway. Peter Lorre playing this wonderful role of this guy who has this total compulsion to kill little girls, and he certainly doesn't want to do it. And whenever he sees a little girl, he sort of goes away and sits in a cafe and tries to drink brandy and read the newspaper and get his mind on something else, but sooner or later he just can't resist going out and killing her. And he feels very sorry for himself. Everybody else treats him like a monster, but he thinks they should have sympathy for him. He can't help it. And then there are some of these movies that you might want to see. Nobody's probably ever heard of a movie Bigger Than Life. It was not a big success. In it, I think it was James Mason played a guy who goes crazy from reading too much Kierkegaard while taking too much cortisone or something. Some drug that oversensitizes him to Kierkegaard, and he says he tries to kill his son. and there's all kinds of complications. And then there are people who go crazy and try to kill themselves without reading Kierkegaard, I think, like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. There's no evidence, is there, that he got this way from reading Kierkegaard. It's those spooky people who put him up to it. But in all those cases, those people are certainly going against the ethical, and you want to be able to say they don't count. They really are in lower immediacy. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is they are compelled, each of them, to do what they do. That is, they can't resist. I mean, Peter Lorre Am is the best example, and it's also the best movie. That's the one I would put in the course if I had time to show somebody compelled into lower immediacy. But you can wonder about anybody. There's this famous thing that Luther said when he quit the Catholic Church and set up Protestantism, Lutheranism. Here I stand, I can do no other. That's very ambiguous. I mean, so does Peter Lorre say that, and James Mason and Jack Nicholson would. Of course, Luther doesn't mean I'm just compelled to go around saying nasty things about the Pope and putting up 14 objections to the Catholic Church on the church door. He means I, being Luther, following my unconditional commitment, am called to do this. The way Abraham is called to kill Isaac, I'm called to go against everything that I've been brought up to love and respect and have authority and so forth. So the question is the difference, but how do you get the difference? Well, it's pretty straightforward. If you can't resist it, if that's what I can do no other means, it's a compulsion. And if it's a compulsion, it's lower immediacy. The basic condition before you can sort of get off the ground in this is that you have to be free not to do it. So Abraham, to go back, is free not to kill Isaac. At any moment he can turn back and say it was a temptation and return to the ethical and do what good fathers do. So the gay person can always turn back and say, this has been a terrible, disgusting thing, and I will never do it again. I'll get married and live happily ever after. I take it to Brokeback Mountain, which I still haven't had time to see. The movie is all about this and timely for the course. But these people are free to go, to turn against what it is their unconditional commitment is calling them to do against the ethical. Of course, they won't be knights of faith suspending the ethical then. They will be normal people giving into the temptation of the ethical. But the main thing for this is that they must be free. So that's on 139. That's not in your reading, but that's the only place I know where he says it. So at the top of 139, Abraham can refrain at any moment. He can repent the whole thing as a temptation. Then he can speak. Then all will understand him. But then he is no longer Abraham. Abraham cannot speak. That's sort of an answer to your point. What's your name again? Elizabeth's point. I mean, cannot speak because in the ethical language there is no way for Abraham to say anything but, I'm murdering Isaac. Yeah. What is what? A non-what person? A not crazy person who kills somebody. Well, there's several possibilities. Good question. One way is, of course, lots of not crazy people kill people. Raskolnikov would be a good example. I mean, he's got his reasons. He thinks that he's better than everybody and higher than the ethical, and we'll have to see what to do about him in a minute. But he's the kind of person you have in mind, I think. And there's Charles Manson. I have a list of seemingly non-crazy people who kill people. And otherwise, there are, of course, non-crazy people like Agamemnon who kill people. One reason for killing people is that there's a higher ethical that says that if, in his case, the king has to save the country and go to war, but you might kill somebody, for instance, if you thought that if you didn't, they would kill lots of other people, so forth. So you can kill people in the name of a higher ethical. But what about people who kill people and just do it because they think they can do it, get away with it? They think they're an exception. Well, that's another criterion we have to get to. So they're free. We're assuming that Raskolnikov and Manson were perfectly free not to go around killing people. Oh, and so what happens then? Okay, we need more criteria. That's what you're saying. That's good. And so I think I already read 85 where he says we need the criteria, but maybe I didn't. If not, I will read it now. At the middle of 185, he says, while those who do not have faith should be prepared to offer some criterion for distinguishing the paradox from a temptation. That's so interesting because 90% of the readers who manage to understand this book at all, in spite of the craziness of it, yeah. Oh, sorry, good point. I knew you had something important to say by the look on your face. Yes, page 85 is where I'm in. I'm in the middle of it. And there we are. While those who have faith should be prepared to offer some criterion for distinguishing the paradox from a temptation. That's right. Obviously, one had better, and we're going to try to do it now. Otherwise, we're going to end up having to conclude really weird people, like Raskolnikov is the best, because he's clearly not under any compulsion, and he's clearly not crazy. So how do we deal with it? Well, the main criterion is, and we get rid of Raskolnikov right off. By the way, I started to say, when he raised his hand, something I think is just important as an aside. The people who read this book, almost none of them ever understand it. But one of the main ways of misunderstanding it is doing what we're doing right now and saying, yeah, but what about Hitler and Charles Manson and Raskolnikov and all these bad guys? You're going to count them as knights of faith to suspending the ethical? And Kierkegaard's onto that. That's what I'm reading you now. He's perfect. He said he's not going to fall for that. He has his criteria for distinguishing knights of faith from the ethical. And the main one is the one we've got to have right now. The knight of faith, respects the universal. That is, unless the knight of faith feels this tension that he's doing something wrong and that he hates doing something wrong, and he hates himself for doing something wrong. Remember, this was the problem with Abraham having to say to himself he's a murderer, and a gay person having to say to themselves they're disgusting, and so forth. And that's because they do respect the ethical. This is on page 106, about 8 lines down. The tragic hero can, in a sense, be helped by the universal. Skipping a little. But the knight of faith is alone about everything. The tragic hero acts and finds his point of rest in the universal. The knight of faith is kept in constant tension. That's not the right thing to read. It's not wrong. Not what I want. Where respect. I'll read that later. Remember that one. We want to be on 103. Yeah, there we are. That's a nice one. About 6 lines down in the first full paragraph. Someone who believes it is a simple enough matter to be the individual, that's the right word there, can always be certain that he is not the knight of faith. For stragglers and vagrant geniuses are not men of faith. Well, a vagrant genius is Raskolnikov, for instance. He thinks he's just so much better than everybody else that he can do whatever he wants. Now he says, faith's knight knows, on the contrary, that it's glorious to belong to the universal. That's very important. They really have to see the total value and the authority of the universal, just as much as if they were a Greek, because they are, as we all are, part Greek, and in this. So he goes on for this beautiful passage. I don't think I've ever read this, and again, for Elizabeth, this is the further statement of what I'm trying to say to you. He knows that it is beautiful and benign to be the particular, who translates himself into the universal. That's the right particular there, the lower one. The one who, so to speak, makes a clear and elegant edition of himself. You see what he's doing? He's finding the language to describe himself, but that everybody can read, as immaculate as possible and readable for all. He knows it is refreshing to become intelligible to oneself in the universal, and so that he understands the universal, and everyone who understands him understands the universal through him in turn, and both rejoice in the security of the universal. Okay, that's what the knight of faith knows, and he knows it as he suspends the universal and goes against it. He respects it. He feels sort of obliged to do it. He feels how great it would be to be able to do it, but he can't do it. Skipping down a bit. Higher up there winds a lonely path, narrow and steep. This is the night of faith now, suspending the ethical. He knows it's terrible to be born in solitude outside the universal, to walk without meeting a single traveler. He knows very well where he is and how he's related to men. Humanly speaking, he's insane and cannot make himself understood to anyone. And yet insane is the mildest expression for him, meaning that he's just absolutely unable not only to say, but to comprehend what in the world he is doing. And again, keep saying, if you don't like the Abraham and Isaac story, which is pretty crazy and far-fetched, take the gay person, take my Nazi example. Just use whatever example to keep reminding you what it's like to be completely alone, utterly unable to speak, and feeling you must be crazy, and yet that this is what you must do. Okay, so that criterion is crucial. And that, in a way, has another part to it, but I have to keep it for a minute. There are three criteria. The first two are important only because they get you to the third one. We've done one. I mean, you've got to be free. That's outside the criteria. That's just a basic condition to get into the game at all, that you're not Peter Lorre or so forth. But once you're in the what you can choose to do business, we've had the first one. You've got to respect the ethical completely. Second, you can't believe that you will have a higher universal, and so you can justify what you're doing against the ordinary universal. And you can't explain it to people, but not because you can't understand it. It's just that they're too stupid to understand it. And eventually you could make them understand it. That would be to have your own higher ethical. That wouldn't be a night of faith suspending the ethical. That would be somebody like Agamemnon subsuming a lower ethical against a higher ethical. You'd be in the universal business. And this is on page 106, where it says, somewhere, in the bottom paragraph, whether the individual is now really in a state of temptation or night of faith, only an individual can decide. Still, it's possible on the basis of the paradox to construct certain criteria, which even someone not in it can understand. And now here's number 2 criterion. The true night of faith is always in absolute isolation. There's a typo there. Is always in absolute isolation. The false night is sectarian. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that's a funny way to put it. But what that means is that the true night of faith can't go around trying to give out principles and get people to, so to speak, join his movement or join him and his sect, whatever it is. That is, he can't think that he's got a new and better universal. Right across from that on page 107 you read, the true night of faith is a witness, never a teacher. That means to be a witness is, I think, just to be able to sacrifice yourself if you have to for this paradox. But as the gay person might well do, or the Aryan kid who's protecting the Jewish girl, or whatever. But that would be to be a witness. But they wouldn't be able to say, I'm doing it for a reason. You guys just don't understand. You've been brainwashed by Hitler, or you've been brought up in this racist society, or something like that. So they have, if the person thinks that they can explain, justify what they're doing, then they also can't be a light of faith suspending the ethical. So that, I mean, they would be proposing a new ethical, in effect. Sometimes Hitler seems to be doing that and giving arguments that why Jews are really just like vermin and dangerous to the culture, and science shows this and so forth. Well, if that's the view one has of Hitler, then he's still ruled out. You're ruled out if you don't respect the ethical, and you're ruled out if you do respect the ethical and think you've got a new, better one. So those are the two. But what the really interesting one, and what you should expect from Kierkegaard if you really have a feel for this, is a third one. And this is sort of what it looks like from the inside. These two other ones you can see from the outside. Does he respect the ethical? Does he think he's got a new ethical? Rule him out. He's not knight of faith, suspending the ethical. The final one is, how does it feel to be a knight of faith? Well, you should know, you feel anguish. The same old anguish you heard about in the very beginning. Only in the world of the spirit, only who feels anguish will get bliss. Only who draws the knife will get the bread. The same anguish that the knight of faith, who sees the sword over the head of the beloved and loves as if it's the surest thing of all, feels all the time. And so, of course, does the person suspending the ethical feel anguish all the time. Now I have to look see if I can find that. Yeah, on 60 is the best expression of this. About 15 lines down. The ethical expression of what Abraham did is that he was willing to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. But in this contradiction lies the very anguish that can indeed make one sleepless. And yet without that anguish, Abraham is not the one he is. That is saying that you have to live in this paradox, in the contradiction, that you can do something you can't understand. And that is the anguish. The anguish of getting more involved while seeing the vulnerable, the anguish of doing what you feel you ought to do while seeing that it's a terribly wrong thing to do. So on 89, you get it again. Abraham can't be mediated. What did I say? 89, top paragraph. Abraham can't be mediated, which can also be put by saying he cannot speak. For the moment he speaks, he expresses the universal. And then he says, in effect, that he's a murderer. And where do I say now? So that, and now, then we go to 106, because that's where he says this tension and dread, that is anguish, are inevitable. I said I read 106 too early, remember? About 15 lines down. The tragic hero can, in a sense, be helped by the universal, but the knight of faith is alone about everything. The tragic hero acts and finds his point of rest in the universal. The knight of faith is kept in constant tension. Well, constant tension is obviously another name for anguish, but we should really find it when he names it. He names it, how about 137? That's outside your reading again, but that's the best place. I don't want you to have to read that whole problem 3, which is mostly a kind of Kierkegaardian, erotic kind of craziness, just to get these few quotes, so just pick them out. On 137, about 2/3 of the way down, this is the punchline for this. For distress and anguish are the only justification conceivable, even though they cannot be conceived in general. Or skipping the next paragraph, Abraham is silent, but he cannot speak. Therein lies the distress and anguish. Okay, so the test for whether the knight of faith if he wants to ask himself, am I a knight of faith suspending the ethical, is that he's in constant anguish because he both respects the ethical and breaks the ethical. Now, anybody want to say anything about that? That's another sort of chunk of what I want to say. Hand up there? Or you're stretching. Okay. Anybody want to say anything? Okay. Well, that only shows, I think, either that, yeah, good. I feel uneasy. I can't believe it's clear and simple. Uh-huh. Interesting. Interesting. I don't know, because he's so confused about what he's doing with Regina, and so what has he done? He thinks that he, like Abraham, has sort of killed her and gone against the ethical, broken this engagement, and he feels that that's the right thing to do and the best thing to do, but he can't explain to himself or her or anybody else why, and so. See, I think he does think that he's a knight of faith. He's got the anguish and the tension. What I think he thinks is that this Silentio, who's writing this book, can't understand being a knight of faith. But you've got to at least have a glimmer, if you're Kierkegaard, writing about what de Silentio can understand and what he can't understand. It's tricky because Kierkegaard never claimed to be the fullest kind of Christian who lived constantly in the paradox. He writes, but, and this is a puzzle for me and you, he writes books, 2 books, from within the highest Christian understanding of what it is to be a human being. And he does it, I think, by saying that he gets it out of the Bible. That if you read the Bible and read about Jesus and what he did, you can see something that he can't do. I believe that must be what it is. You will see it, by the way, just so I'll tell you now, what you're holding is the most important piece, I think, of the most important book. If you want to understand the highest form of Christianity, it's a book called The Concept of Anxiety or Dread. What is it called on there? It gets translated 2 different ways. I forget which way it gets translated on the piece of paper you have. No, it isn't The Concept of Dread. Boy, am I speaking nonsense. It's Sickness Unto Death. Concept of Dread is a different Kierkegaard book, and it's not written by any of these guys. I mean, it's written by some other pseudonym. No, the Sickness Unto Death is Kierkegaard's book about the despair of all the wrong ways of life and the only right way, which is being a Christian, and he does not put his name on it. He makes up a pseudonym for it, says this pseudonym is a higher form of Christian than he's ever able to be. All that is related to your question. Okay, what else? Yeah.
Absolute commitment. But I guess I'm still confused on exactly what one is.
You're right already. Yeah, it's very confusing what Kierkegaard says about God. And I want it to mean that it's his calling, it's his unconditional commitment. I want it not to be a calling from a supreme being, because he's pretty clear that, and I put the quote on your page that I gave you because I thought you otherwise wouldn't believe me. At the very bottom of the page, I forget which page, I give you the quote about God that I constantly have in the background, and it's from Sickness Unto Death. So it's from the crucial book. And it's on page 2, I think. If you look, I didn't bring page 2, it looks like. So what is it at the bottom of page 2 that God is that all things are possible? Yeah, okay. God is that all things are possible, and all things are possible is God. He's trying to get you out of thinking of God as a supreme being, as the creator, as an object that you can love. Remember, it's de Silentio who loves God like a super being and feels full of love for God and full of happiness when he's contemplating God. That's all too Platonic. That's not real Christianity, Kierkegaard says. And you don't need God of the sort that you all think God is, if you realize that Jesus was God, Kierkegaard would say. And once a religion has produced the God-man, this person who is a human being at a finite temporal time in a certain place, he was there at whatever it was, A.D., in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and he was God at the same time. When you get a religion that has produced that, you don't need to have a relation to the Supreme Being. You're very well off. You've got the God has come so close, and Jesus can do everything for you that God can do for you. And Kierkegaard also says that once God becomes man, access to God as a supreme being is cut off. That means either there isn't any, or there is, but you can't get there or find out. At least it's irrelevant. I think the right thing to say, for Kierkegaard, it's the way Christianity is set up. The whole idea, and now comes the hard part. I mean, this is the easy part. I haven't answered you yet. Because that's why, therefore, God should be, in this book, the calling. Whatever it is that you get called to do this unconditional something. But there's nobody doing the calling. and he doesn't talk about praying to God, and he doesn't, and so forth. There is just this fact about the way the world is and people are, that there is unconditional callings to people, and that's one aspect of God. I think God has three aspects. Two of them are all right, and one of them is a mess, the way Kierkegaard sets it up. The other aspect of God is that all things are possible, and God has got to be that. Because otherwise, the aspect of God, which is the calling, would get you to resignation. But it's only because you can be called to an unconditional commitment and all things are possible, even the inconceivable is possible, that you can live in a way you can't understand. So the second function of God is, there's the calling, and there's a certain way of living that you can't understand, and God is the name for the sort of, I think of it as a kind of atmosphere or something that makes that possible. It's not an entity. There is this sort of atmosphere. If you get in touch with it, and how do you get in touch with it? Through faith. If you get in touch with it through faith, you are able to live seeing the sword over the head of the beloved and get involved more and more. You are able to go against the ethical and feel justified. But you only can do all that, of course, in anguish, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Now, the third problem about God is the fact, and here's where I have to just do a heavy interpretation on it. I don't see how you can make sense of it unless you deal with it the way I'm about to deal with it. So God now, in the Abraham story, calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Now, it's one thing for God to be Abraham's calling, his defining thing, to be the father of the faith and go and kill knock over all those idols and stuff. It's another thing to understand how God as a calling, God as an atmosphere, can go around telling Abraham to kill his own defining commitment, namely Isaac. That makes no sense. That's what you sense. That's what all of you sense that. And I feel like if only I could get that out of this book or get that book out of this course, I would be happy, because it's hard to deal with it. Here's what you have to think. God is some kind of absolute relation to the absolute, as he calls it, which comes in and says, your defining commitment is impossible, and your defining period. Let's start with that. Now, what can that be? Well, you have to think of that, I think, as the vulnerability of the defining commitment. I mean, the third aspect of God is that there's something that you can't control or understand or predict that can at any minute take your defining commitment away from you. And that requires you to, in a certain sense, give up your unconditional commitment if you're being reasonable. It requires, if you've got any imagination, you don't have to kill Isaac. You just have to be able to see that you can't get involved this way. You see the sword. Oh, I remember, I just said it to myself this morning. The third function of God is to be the sword hanging over the head of the beloved. There's something that limits your unconditional commitment and makes it dangerous. So God is the calling. God is the thing that limits the unconditional commitment and makes it dangerous. And God is that all things are possible atmosphere that makes you able to stick with your unconditional commitment anyway. And no wonder you can't understand it. Kierkegaard's using God in these three different ways, and none of these ways is the way you're used to God being, namely the supreme being and the creator and the source of all meaning and intelligibility and all that. That's all. Kierkegaard wants to throw that all out and give it back to Plato. Does that help any? Or just drive you crazy? Okay. Well, you have to keep asking about that. It's my job, I must admit, to try to make sense of it, but I can't make any more sense of it than I just did. But I can do it again and again. Yeah. Why what? Okay. Well, why does Abraham have to listen to God? Well, if, as I'm claiming, God is the absolute limit on your commitment, namely that the sword is hanging over the head of the beloved, that's not just a fact. It isn't just improbable that your loved one will die. They will. I mean, it may be you're lucky, you may die first, but this whole relationship is going to be vulnerable and is going to be destroyed, and that you're going to have to be able to accept that and live with it and act on it, even though you don't understand what you're doing when you're acting on it. That's it. I mean, so God isn't just any old trouble. God is this fundamental trouble that everything in space and time is going to. God is behind. God makes every absolute commitment happen by calling you. Although there's, remember, nobody there calling. You get a calling. And God is there making every absolute commitment dangerous, and therefore making you anxious. That's the sword hanging over the head of the beloved. God is both the calling. That's what drives you crazy. God is both the calling and what makes the calling something that is so dangerous that you don't want to have it, and it isn't even rational to have it, and which makes it possible to have it anyway. That's this third thing. God is that all things are possible. And faith, you don't have faith when you get the calling. That just happens. And you don't need faith to understand that it's all, that death is behind everything, as Calloway says. That's just the way it is. But you do need faith to be able to act in a way that you can't understand. To do what is impossible, even though you can't think it. And remember, to do what is impossible is to go accept the calling, even though it's vulnerable, and get more and more involved and be defenseless. And it's to go against the ethical and do absolutely awful things while feeling nonetheless this is the best thing you've ever done. Those things you can do, even though you can't understand how, because God is there. Namely, there is somehow in the universe a way that even the impossible is possible. Yeah. No, that's the wrong way to put it. If you get a calling, you believe in God, because we're going to redefine God. So I mean, you'll believe in God if you feel that there's an unconditional commitment calling you, and you're doing it. For Kierkegaard's point of view, that is to believe in God. To spell it out a little more, you will be acting in a way that is sort of like the way the disciples acted when they understood that they should make Jesus the center of their life, and that way they would become individuals, and that would save them from despair, and so forth. When they understood that, they understood everything there was to understand about Jesus being God, and it happens when Dante understands that Beatrice is his savior. So once you get called, whatever calls you is your savior. And this will be a little mind-boggling, but I'll throw it in. Whatever calls you creates you as an individual, so that it's in a way your creator. That's what's left of the creator story. Jesus created these apostles and renamed them. I only know that he named Saul, or Saul at least understood that he was now named Paul. But all Mark and Luke and all those aren't these people's original name. They've been recreated, reborn. They are new beings, to talk like Kierkegaard does in Fear and Trembling at one point. The defining call can create you as a new being. And Jesus has the further thing. That's what makes him more than just any calling. He changes the whole history of the world. He creates a new world. The Christian world, not the Greek world, and everything has changed. In my other course, I try to explain what's changed, but it would not be this course. Okay, good. You see, I stopped, and there were plenty of good questions. Yeah, maybe more. Okay, go ahead. Oh, okay. That's easy. The Danish church is the Lutheran church. You'd think that he would be happy to be a good Lutheran, and I think he thinks he is a good Lutheran, but the Danish church was, as you just said it, the state church, and just being born, we got an echo, haven't we? Just being born in Denmark was enough to make you a Christian. And therefore, he says, the church is the big block to being a Christian, because everybody can just relax and think they're a Christian. And he thinks that's terrible, and it's very, very hard to be a Christian. To be a Christian, what you have to do is be a knight of faith. And to be a knight of faith, you have to live in anguish. And there's nothing about that in being preached by the church. In fact, the church has fallen for Hegel and his friends, ex-friends, who were preachers in the church, or pastors, or whatever they were called in Lutheran churches. He thinks have sold out to Hegel. So the church becomes a big enemy. And the last book he wrote, I think I mentioned, is Attack on Christendom, where he attacks the church and all of the bishops, or whatever they're called. I think they're bishops. And he does it, you could say, because they're corrupted by philosophy, to put it as politely as possible, I guess. So he thinks it's his mission to sacrifice everything, his love of Regina and the chance to do anything else. He wrote from morning till night. I don't know, he must have written at least 40 books. I haven't counted them. But, and to do all that, and for what? To make Christianity the most difficult thing that you could possibly have. And, of course, the most rewarding, because he who has the anguish has the bliss. And thereby to show everybody that they're in despair and how to get out of it, which is what I'm going to talk about next time. That's a sensible question. Anything else? I'm ready to go on, but I'm also happy to straighten out all these loose ends. Yeah.
What effect did that have on it?
Well, I can just say huge effect. It didn't change Catholic theology, and I have this funny feeling that the Danes were the last to understand. There's nothing good written about Kierkegaard in Danish, as far as I know, and although they do a nice job of editing the collected works in Copenhagen, but it had a huge influence on Protestant theologians, famous ones that you may not have heard of anymore. Paul Tillich was the big one when I was an undergraduate. But there's Bultmann, and there's Karl Barth, and they're all variations. But all these people who, any kind of existentialist Christianity comes out of Kierkegaard's thing, which is to, I mean, it seems to me that's pretty important. He didn't, by the way, influence Dostoevsky a bit. Dostoevsky has his own completely original version of Christianity. I don't think he knew Kierkegaard stuff. Okay, I want to go back to this and cover one more thing before we finish today. Yeah, okay. So now, the next mind-boggling thing, if you're still got enough strength to take on one more hard thing. What does it mean that Abraham is able to get a new Isaac? Well, it was easy, relatively easy, to give you what we could call the MIT equation about grief and how if you interiorize the loved one, you can keep them as part of your identity and still be open to another finite temporal person to love. That's something, when you're doing it, you can't be explaining it to yourself or it won't work, but you can do it. You can, while feeling completely that this is the last person you'll ever love and you want to be dead too, if you do that in the field of all things are possible, you'll come out able to love somebody else. But what is this? And then you would get a new Isaac. Remember, he actually talks about getting a new Isaac on 139. He mentions it. He talks about, and again, it's not in your reading, but he says, the Lord will give me a new Isaac on the strength of the absurd. That's what Abraham is saying to himself. And there's another place. I had two. Well, the other one is I won't bother to read because it's getting a new Isaac. See, I think there are two getting new Isaacs. I'm going beyond the book now. That's why I say this is hard and you have to brace yourself. There's nothing in Kierkegaard to fit what I'm saying. Just as I'm going to explain what getting a new Isaac is. I explained it already for Hiroshima Mon Amour. That is, I explained it for what the Knight of Faith, like the Japanese man, had to do, namely go through grief. Now, what can you say? What would it be like to get a new ethical? And how would you do it? Well, I think the answer is almost too easy. That is, to get a new ethical is to go through the cultural suffering, whatever it takes. It isn't as clearly described as grief, at least if it is, I don't know about it. But you do it in such a way that you change the ethical. Now, that's inconceivable you can change the ethical, but it was inconceivable you could change the defining relation. It's eternal. But you can pull this peculiar move where you change the eternal in time. Remember, you change your relation to the defining person, though you don't get rid of them as giving you a meaning in your life that lasts forever. You change how you relate to them when they're gone. That's fine. Well, here you're going to change the eternal again. Certainly the ethical is universal and seems to be eternal because it's inconceivable that you could think about it any other way. It's inconceivable to have a culture where murder is just all right. Fathers can kill their sons as long as they say, I was called to do it. It's inconceivable that these depraved homosexuals could be living normal, healthy, happy, moral human lives and get married even. This is just outrageously impossible. But it happens. And how does it happen? Well, it requires that people who have faith live in the anxiety of, say, being homosexual or protecting Jews under Nazi Germany. And if they can do that, then the culture can go through enough suffering through what they have to go through if they're gay and straight in Copenhagen or Jew-loving in Nazi Germany. If somehow they suffer enough of that, the ethical does change. It's just that you can't tell the story backwards. Remember, we talked about that. It's not all right to say, well, good. Now we know how unparadoxical things were in Copenhagen in 1850 or in Nazi Germany. No, they were absolutely paradoxical, and the person was in anguish, and there's no way to get around that. But nonetheless, you can finally get the inconceivable transformed into what's conceivable, and that's what Kierkegaard doesn't know how to do, doesn't know how anybody does it, only knows in this dim way that if Isaac is the ethical, and if you are a paradoxical enough person, and you believe in faith enough, and you act on what you can't understand, you can get a new Isaac, which is a new ethical. And it's inconceivable you can get a new Isaac, but you get it anyway. You can't get it, maybe. Maybe it takes the culture to get it. But it can't happen that a new ethical comes and people get a new language, and being gay becomes something that's okay. Yeah.
Suffering is that have to be addressed back to trauma.
Is that what he thinks? Yes. But let me repeat it to make sure I got clear for the podcasting. So am I saying that you have to go through all this suffering to change society? A trauma. Somebody repeat what she says. I can't hear her well enough from here. What?
It's like, when you go through enough suffering, like, no, I don't get that. Lack of trauma. Oh,
Change the ethical. Yes, right. I think that's what I am saying. See, I don't know how to describe it like grief. I just think you'd have to describe each time in detail. What did happen? Well, enough gay people suffered somehow, and their suffering, but made it possible for them to understand, and through them for everybody else to understand that they were human beings and okay too. And I don't know whether under Nazi Germany it could ever have happened, because they would have been killed off, each person who tried to do it. But maybe it would have happened. the important thing is that it can happen, that through a certain amount of suffering, what was inconceivable, couldn't be put in the language of ethics, was literally unintelligible, gets a new language about what is worthy, and makes what was seeming to be sinful okay. And that must be what it is to get a new Isaac. And now the question is sort of interesting. Why is this something that happens in our culture? Well, it goes back to being this kind of conflicted culture that we are. If there was only the ethical, we'd just be stuck in our ethical. I think that's how the Greeks presumably were. They were making it more and more clear, presumably people like Plato and Aristotle, but basically their ethical was set. It's only because we get this Judeo-Christian thing coming in of somebody coming along, and that was Jesus, who flipped the whole Hebrew story into a completely different story. I can't go into the details, but let's just say the same thing that Paul says in the Bible, that a religion of the law and external actions which were either good or bad, it could be judged, became a religion of desire, and Jesus switches everything around where people get judged on their desire. So he says in the Sermon on the Mount, he commits adultery who lusts after a woman in his heart. That's a crazy thing to say from a Hebrew point of view, because you just either commit adultery or you don't, and it's perfectly obvious. It's a fact, and then there's a law against it, and then if you did it, you get stoned, and that's that. But you could invent a whole new religion in which desire was what was important and purity was what was important, and you couldn't bring it about by willpower. The more you tried to resist lusting after women in your heart, the more you would do it. So you can't help yourself. You need a savior outside who will help you, and everything gets shifted around. Is different after that. And we're in a culture, I think, thanks to the God-man. I don't think we had this in our culture before then. We're in a culture in which you can have sort of radical new understandings of the ethical, because you can have the people who are, so to speak, crazy from everybody's point of view, but who win out after a lot of sacrifices and martyrs and suffering, and people come to see it their way. So that makes our culture a very interesting kind of culture. Because we have this conflict. If we didn't have the ethical, there'd just be a bunch of crazies running around. You couldn't tell the people who had a new ethical from the people who were the Charles Mansons and the Raskolnikovs. So you need the ethical, the Greek. If we didn't have the Christian, we wouldn't have an idea that you could have the way of behaving that goes against the ethical that was higher than the ethical. There wouldn't be anything higher than the ethical. But if you put the two together, you get the possibility of people acting in such a way that though they can't understand it, and nobody else can understand what they're doing, if they act in the faith that even the impossible is possible, it may actually become really intelligible what they were doing and what the culture was doing. And that makes our culture a very interesting kind of culture. We are supposedly, the sociologists say, the only hot culture. In most cultures, the ethical stays fixed, and what counts as real stays fixed. But in our culture, the ethical has changed many times, certainly from the Greek pagan kind of ethical to the Christian kind of ethical to the Kantian kind of ethical to our maybe something like the medical kind of ethical, where the question is whether gays are sick or not, and when you discover that they're not sick, then that changes the worthiness of them, and so forth. And I can't explain this in this course, it's in the Heidegger course, but we've had about 6 different understandings of reality. But you can sort of imagine the Romans thought reality was stuff that you produced, and the Christians thought reality was created by God, and the moderns think that reality is interpreted by us, and so forth. So that means that we're the richest kind of culture. It may not be for the best. It's hard to know whether we're going downhill or uphill with this. But I'm enough of an optimist to think that it's a good thing that through suffering, the ethical can be changed, because in general, through suffering, the ethical gets improved, I believe, and we've got the only culture that can do it, and Kierkegaard is on to how contradictory and paradoxical it is for us to be able to do it. Okay, that's enough for today.